More actors have been destroyed by politics than bad reviews, one studio executive once whispered, and he wasn't talking about Washington. In Golden Age Hollywood, scripts weren't the only things being edited. Reputations were redacted, careers cut short, and ideologies rewritten. But who was really pulling the strings behind the glamour? What secret political agendas shaped the stars we still idolize? Stay with us, because behind the fame and flashing lights, some of Hollywood's most powerful roles were never listed in the credits. Walt Disney's FBI informant status. You know what's more surreal than a talking mouse building a media empire? Walt Disney feeding names to the FBI like he was auditioning for the lives of others. Behind his carefully crafted image as America's imaginative uncle was a man quietly collaborating with J. Edgar Hoover. During the late 1940s and into the 50s, Disney provided the FBI with intel on employees and union organizers he suspected of having communist sympathies. He wasn't just casually patriotic, he was a full-blown informant with a classified special agent in charge contact badge. It all started after the bitter 1941 Disney animators strike. Walt felt personally betrayed, convinced that labor activism was rooted in subversion. So when HUAC came knocking, he didn't hesitate. He publicly testified, naming former animators and labeling them as communist agitators, all while claiming he was just protecting American values. In reality, it was Disney Studios that held tyrannical control, with loyalty oaths and surveillance becoming part of studio culture. And then there was the back-scratching. Disney allowed the FBI to vet scripts and even offered Disneyland as a propaganda-friendly space. In return, Hoover gave Disney's name a clean bill of patriotic health. While Mickey smiled on screen, Walt was helping shape the Red Scare off it. The man who created a fantasy world of dreams was, in private, helping police the real-world dreams of others. Ronald Reagan's anti-communist reporting. Before he was president, before he was the Gipper, Ronald Reagan was a Hollywood actor with a polished jawline and a secret grudge against the left. As president of the Screen Actors Guild in the late 1940s, Reagan worked closely with FBI agents behind the scenes, quietly supplying names of those he believed to be communists, or at least suspiciously progressive. The Cold War wasn't just happening in Europe, it was boiling over on the studio lots. Reagan, once a New Deal Democrat, had shifted rightward by the time HUAC made its rounds through Hollywood. In public, he championed free expression. In private, he was penning letters to J. Edgar Hoover and helping screenwriters, directors, and even extras for political loyalty. What made Reagan especially valuable to the Bureau was his blend of credibility and charisma. He wasn't just a snitch, he was a PR dream. He knew how to smile for the camera while tightening the ideological noose. He even claimed that communist sympathizers were trying to take over SAG, which justified his surveillance activities. Later biographies would reveal how he'd meet with FBI agents at his home, sometimes without his wife Nancy's knowledge. All of this helped cement his image as a strong anti-communist figure, laying the foundation for his political rise. Reagan wasn't just acting on screen, he was performing off it too, in a decades-long drama where the credits still haven't fully rolled. The Hollywood 10 Blacklist Operation. In 1947, 10 screenwriters and directors stood before Congress and refused to name names. They were hauled out like criminals, not because they committed crimes, but because they wouldn't cooperate. They became known as the Hollywood 10, and their refusal to answer the House Un-American Activities Committee was the match that lit the full-blown inferno of the blacklist era. Their real offense? Political belief. Or more precisely, the suspicion of having ever entertained leftist thoughts, attended union meetings, or simply refused to cooperate with political witch hunts. These weren't subversives plotting a coup, they were writers, wordsmiths. But to HUAC, they were dangerous precisely because of their reach. Stories inspire, and Washington didn't want any inspiration from the left sneaking into the silver screen. So the 10 were blacklisted, jailed, and their careers shredded. Studios issued public statements, some gleefully, that they would never employ them again. The message was clear. Loyalty to the state came before loyalty to truth, to craft, or to conscience. Even when some of the 10, like Dalton Trumbo, continued writing Oscar-winning scripts under pseudonyms, they couldn't claim their work. Not openly. The blacklist was a death sentence in disguise, and Hollywood itself played the role of executioner, letting political paranoia reshape its own soul. Howard Hughes's funding of anti-communist films. Howard Hughes was never a man short on money or enemies. The aviation mogul, film producer, and recluse wasn't just eccentric, he was politically charged, and in the post-war era, he became obsessed with driving communism out of Hollywood by any means necessary. In the late 1940s and early 50s, Hughes covertly funded and distributed films with strong anti-communist messages. These weren't subtle parables, they were propaganda disguised as cinema. One of his most infamous projects was I Married a Communist, a not-so-veiled thriller that warned America about the Red Menace infecting everyday life. But Hughes wasn't just anti-communist. He was anti-union, anti-liberal, and deeply invested in purging what he saw as dangerous elements from the industry. When he took over RKO Pictures in 1948, his first order of business wasn't creative, it was political. He fired suspected leftists, banned controversial scripts, and turned the studio into a Cold War battleground. By using film as a weapon of ideology, Hughes was ahead of his time. He blurred the line between entertainment and state messaging, effectively turning RKO into a production arm of conservative fear-mongering. And yet, despite his crusade, Hughes's erratic behavior eventually overshadowed his political machinations. But for a time, his millions fueled a campaign of paranoia and censorship that helped tighten the grip of the blacklist and silence dissident voices in the name of patriotism. Lucille Ball's communist registration. In 1953, America almost canceled its favorite redhead, not because of a scandal, but because of the Red Scare. A resurfaced document revealed that Lucille Ball had registered to vote as a communist in 1936. The public panicked. Newspapers ran headlines questioning whether Lucy was loyal to her country. Sponsors threatened to pull out. Ball's explanation: she said she registered as a favor to her grandfather, a lifelong socialist who wanted her to support the cause. She claimed she never attended meetings, never paid dues, never even read the Communist Manifesto. But in the anti-red climate of the time, it didn't matter. Ball was now a political liability. The irony: she and Desi Arnaz had just revolutionized television with I Love Lucy. They had everything to lose. So Desi staged one of the most clever cover-ups in TV history. He took to a live taping and told the studio audience, "The only thing red about Lucy is her hair, and even that's not legitimate." Laughter, relief, case closed, or so they hoped. Behind the scenes, the couple scrambled. The FBI quietly cleared her after a full investigation, likely aided by her fame and Desi's behind-the-scenes maneuvering. But for a few weeks, the most beloved woman on television was almost blacklisted because of a single checkbox on a voter registration form from nearly 2 decades earlier. Darryl F. Zanuck and the World War II propaganda pipeline. Picture a Hollywood mogul leafing through Battlefront reports like they're script notes. That was Darryl F. Zanuck, the hard-charging chief of 20th Century Fox, who treated World War II as the studio's most lucrative genre. By 1942, he'd snagged a colonel's rank in the Army Signal Corps, but stayed anchored to the lot, holding hush-hush meetings with the Office of War Information. The bargain was blunt. Fox would slip pro-Allied talking points into every frame, and Washington would keep its censorship scissors sheathed. Zanuck didn't simply approve flag-waving epics. He micromanaged dialogue, shot lists, even poster taglines to make sure each reel sold sacrifice, and stamped out any whiff of isolationism. When the Purple Heart dramatized American POWs facing Japanese torture, Zanuck ignored pleas from diplomats worried it would inflame hate. He wanted fury because fury filled seats and war bond drives. He also buried scripts that hinted U.S. troops were shell-shocked, drunk, or disillusioned. Those realities were bad for morale, he said, code for bad for Monday grosses. The payoff? Fox Pictures won praise from FDR's inner circle, while Zanuck secured privileged access to combat footage no other studio could touch. But the trade-off was costly. Nuanced storytelling drowned under marching band scores, and dissenting writers found their pages shredded before the first table read. Zanuck's polished propaganda fed a nation hungry for heroes, yet it also proved how easily Hollywood's dream factory could be retrofitted into an assembly line for government messaging. No bayonets required, just studio contracts and a cigar-chomping boss who understood that politics, too, is show business. Charlie Chaplin's FBI dossier and forced exile. Audiences saw The Tramp, a sweet vagabond tilting at tyrants. J. Edgar Hoover saw something else, a foreign-born agitator with a dangerous gift for swaying the masses. By the late 1930s, the FBI had opened a full file on Charlie Chaplin, thickening it with informant gossip, intercepted cables, and even bedroom rumors. Hoover loathed Chaplin's satirical jabs at fascism, capitalism, and, by implication, Washington's own power plays. When the great dictator dared mock Hitler before the U.S. officially entered the war, Chaplin became political kryptonite. Congressional hawks painted him as a communist sympathizer. Tabloids splashed lurid headlines about his affairs with younger women to sour public sentiment. The Bureau pounced, revoking his re-entry permit while he sailed to London for a 1952 premiere. Chaplin, one of cinema's founding fathers, found himself effectively deported without trial, proof that a man could be erased by paperwork alone. He resettled in Switzerland, where snow-dusted silence replaced studio applause. Hollywood insiders, terrified of HUAC, quietly excised his name from projects. Even his classics slipped into distribution limbo. Only in 1972, after 2 decades of self-exile, did Chaplin return to accept an honorary Oscar, escorted by security, still shadowed by suspicion. The ovation lasted 12 minutes, but the backstory lasted a lifetime. An artist who'd pulled laughter from poverty ended up exiled for laughing at power. The FBI file ballooned past 1,900 pages, yet never proved treason, only the threat that a single well-timed joke can pose to those who fear an audience more than an army. Elia Kazan and the names that echoed. Elia Kazan could conjure raw humanity on screen, A Streetcar Named Desire on the waterfront, but in 1952, he stepped off stage into a political thriller of his own making. Summoned before HUAC, the celebrated director faced a brutal calculus: protect former comrades from his brief 1930s Communist Party flirtation, or protect the empire he'd built at Fox and on Broadway. Kazan chose career over comradeship, supplying 8 names in a closed session, then doubling down in public testimony. Hollywood's reaction split like brittle glass. Studio chiefs sent champagne, blacklisted writers sent wordless, chilling silence. Kazan insisted he named only those already exposed, yet for the 8, his confirmation was the nail that sealed their professional coffins. Critics boycotted his premieres. Playwright Clifford Odets, himself gray-listed, immortalized the betrayal in dialogue dripped with venom. Kazan, ever the storyteller, defended himself by making On the Waterfront, a film lionizing an informant who does the right thing. Oscars followed, but so did grudges that never cooled. Even decades later, when the Academy awarded him an honorary Oscar in 1999, protesters lined the aisle, arms crossed, refusing applause. Kazan's genius was undeniable, but so was the damage. He turned testimony into self-preservation, art into confession, and left Hollywood with a lingering question: can brilliance absolve betrayal? His answer flickers across screens still, beautiful, haunting, and forever contested within every frame he left behind. Barbara Stanwyck's quiet right-wing war chest. Barbara Stanwyck burnished an image of tough, independent heroines. Think Double Indemnity's femme fatale with a heart of ice. Off-screen, she was just as steely, channeling her Depression-era bitterness into a covert political machine. While colleagues hosted martini-soaked salon debates, Stanwyck bankrolled the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, a hard-right group that lobbied against New Deal reforms and union power. She kept her signature under wraps, funneling donations through intermediaries and private luncheons at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Studio gossip columns praised her versatility. None mentioned she was ghostwriting letters to Congress decrying collectivist infiltration. She partnered with John Wayne, Ward Bond, and mogul Spyros Skouras to vet scripts for subversive subtext, sometimes yanking entire projects from production. Crew members who pushed for shorter hours or safer sets found themselves quietly blackballed, never knowing the decision traced back to Stanwyck's discreet phone calls. Yet she never paraded her politics on talk shows. Public neutrality preserved her box office draw. Behind closed doors, though, she lobbied Republican candidates and financed pamphlets equating labor agitation with Soviet sabotage. By the time McCarthyism peaked, Stanwyck's shadow network had already softened Hollywood's resistance, normalizing loyalty oaths long before HUAC demanded them. She remains immortal on screen, but her silent off-screen crusade shows how a single star, operating in dim corridors instead of spotlights, can tilt the ideological set design of an entire industry without the audience ever catching the cue. Edward G. Robinson's reluctant purge. Edward G. Robinson's raspy gangster snarl made him the face of 1930s crime cinema, but off-camera, he crusaded against fascism, raising millions for war relief years before Pearl Harbor. Post-war, that same activism turned radioactive. Hugh S. grilled Robinson in 1950, waving files of charities he'd supported, many later flagged as front organizations for the party. He was never a member, but guilt by donation was enough to dim the marquee lights. Studios, wary of bad press, stopped calling. Robinson went from A-list leads to B-movie cameos almost overnight. Desperate to clear his name, he met quietly with FBI liaison Ronald Reagan at SAG, seeking advice. The Bureau suggested a penitent path, named the communist sympathizers who'd advised his philanthropy. Over 2 closed-door sessions, Robinson supplied more than a dozen names, writers, lawyers, even a rabbi, insisting he thought they were simply humanitarians. He signed affidavits, issued press statements, and took whatever roles he could, including shifty villains, that mocked the very idealism he'd once championed. The purge worked commercially. Robinson clawed back into prestige pictures like The Ten Commandments. But friends never forgot. Dalton Trumbo called him the kindest man who did the cruelest thing. Robinson died in 1973, honored as a Hollywood legend, yet his memoir tiptoes around 1950, the year he traded progressive zeal for professional survival. His story underlines the blacklist's bleakest lesson. Sometimes, the celluloid tough guy isn't tough enough to weather real-world threats, and the ransom demanded is measured in other people's futures. John Wayne's covert political crusade. To the public, John Wayne was the straight-shooting American cowboy, the very embodiment of rugged patriotism. But behind that stoic facade was a man waging a quiet political war against Hollywood's left. In 1944, Wayne joined the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an ultra-conservative group aimed at purging communist influence from the industry. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was a one-man surveillance team in a 10-gallon hat. Wayne worked with HUAC behind the scenes, compiling internal reports and quietly flagging writers, actors, and even crew members who expressed so-called anti-American sentiments. According to declassified documents, he lobbied studios to deny work to suspicious personalities and used his position at the top of Hollywood's food chain to enforce a kind of ideological screening process. He even clashed with screenwriter Carl Foreman, who had written High Noon, a film Wayne considered un-American for its themes of moral ambiguity and civic cowardice. He later starred in Rio Bravo, which was deliberately crafted as a conservative rebuttal. This wasn't creative rivalry, it was an ideological shootout. Though Wayne never named names publicly before HUAC, he did plenty of damage from the shadows. His friendships with FBI agents, studio bosses, and political donors gave him influence far beyond the set. To many, he was the voice of American values, but to those blacklisted, silenced, or pressured into silence, John Wayne was just another powerful man weaponizing patriotism to police ideas. MGM's secret dealings with HUAC. When the House Un-American Activities Committee began targeting Hollywood in the late 1940s, the studios scrambled not to protect free speech, but to protect their assets. At the center of the quiet negotiations stood MGM, the dream factory that operated like a heavily guarded castle. And its king, Louis B. Mayer, was already making backroom deals before the subpoenas even hit. MGM's arrangement was simple: cooperate to stay clean. Mayer discreetly agreed to voluntary compliance with HUAC, supplying lists of left-leaning employees and committing to a policy that denied work to anyone who refused to name names. Internally, MGM instituted its own ideological vetting system, combing through past political donations, union participation, and even private dinner party chatter. Some writers were asked to rewrite scripts multiple times to remove the subtext, even if no one ever clarified what that meant. Stars with liberal reputations were quietly dropped from casting shortlists. One rising starlet, known for attending Roosevelt campaign rallies, found herself benched for over a year, with no reason given. Off the books, Mayer had fixed that too. Meanwhile, MGM launched a series of safe, patriotic films, often working with the Office of War Information and later the FBI to ensure every frame reinforced American values. The result? While other studios faced backlash and boycotts, MGM glided through the McCarthy years largely unscathed. But that safety came at a cost. Careers destroyed, voices silenced, and a powerful example set. When art is treated like property, its owners will do anything to protect the brand, even if that means trading ideals for immunity. Judy Holliday's dumb blonde defense strategy. Judy Holliday had the timing of a genius and the face of a sweetheart, but when she was called to testify before HUAC in 1952, she used something else entirely, her dumb blonde persona. Audiences knew her from Born Yesterday, where she played a ditzy girlfriend who turned out to be smarter than everyone else. And Judy leaned into that role with razor precision. Though she had never been a Communist Party member, her past affiliations with progressive groups and peace organizations placed her under suspicion. HUAC was hoping she'd fold or confess. Instead, she gave vague, meandering answers. She appeared confused, adorable, and most importantly, harmless. She never invoked the fifth. She never refused to cooperate. She just didn't give them anything useful. Behind the baby voice was a tactical mind. Judy had studied how other actors, like the Hollywood 10, had been punished for defiance. So she acted. She smiled, fumbled her words, and subtly made it impossible to pin anything on her. It was theater, just not the kind Congress expected. And it worked. Her career survived. She wasn't blacklisted. She kept working in film and stage, but privately, she resented the performance. Friends said she felt humiliated having to play dumb to stay employed. She beat the system, yes, but only by pretending to be exactly the kind of woman the system preferred, ornamental, unthreatening, and apolitical. In a town where everyone's playing a part, Judy Holliday wrote a script so clever, even HUAC didn't realize they'd been outperformed. Dalton Trumbo's Secret Screenwriting Rebellion. Dalton Trumbo wasn't just a screenwriter, he was a symbol. Blacklisted in 1947 as one of the Hollywood 10, Trumbo refused to testify before HUAC, citing the First Amendment instead of the Fifth. That defiance cost him everything. Studios banned his name, producers erased his credits, and he was cast out like a virus. But Trumbo wasn't done. He simply went underground. Operating through a network of fronts, actors, or lesser-known writers who would put their names on his scripts, Trumbo secretly penned dozens of screenplays. He wrote Roman Holiday under a pseudonym. The film won an Oscar. So did The Brave One. Both times, he had to watch others accept his awards. His defiance wasn't loud, it was productive. Trumbo turned out pages in his bathtub, cigarette dangling from his lips, a glass of bourbon nearby. He smuggled his politics into subtext, his rage into characters, and his presence into a town that pretended he didn't exist. Producers knew, of course, everyone did, but as long as no one said it out loud, the system stayed intact. Finally, in 1960, director Otto Preminger broke ranks and openly hired Trumbo to write Exodus. Then Kirk Douglas demanded that Trumbo be credited for Spartacus. The blacklist began to crumble, not because of moral awakening, but because Hollywood needed its best writers back. Trumbo didn't just survive, he cracked the blacklist from the inside, using talent as resistance and his typewriter as a weapon. His quiet revenge was turning in scripts so good, even his enemies couldn't keep him silent. Frank Sinatra's shifting political ties. Frank Sinatra didn't just swing the mic, he swung votes. At first, Old Blue Eyes was Hollywood's loudest liberal. He campaigned for FDR, supported civil rights, and even helped organize desegregated concerts. But by the mid-1950s, something shifted. The man who once called out bigotry and fascism started cozying up to figures like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And underneath that swing was a political recalibration no one fully saw coming. Part of it was strategic. Sinatra's rumored mob connections had put him under FBI surveillance for years, and his early ties to leftist causes were beginning to look suspicious in the McCarthy era. Aligning himself with conservative power players became a kind of shield. By 1972, he was performing at Nixon's inauguration. There were whispers that Sinatra was acting as a go-between, linking Hollywood donors with Republican campaigns. Others claimed he passed information to political operatives about suspected radicals in the entertainment world. Publicly, he denied it all. Privately, he made calculated decisions about who he was seen with and where he stood. He never fully abandoned his earlier ideals, but he learned how to silence them when needed. That made him more than a crooner. It made him a political chameleon, willing to shift colors depending on who was in power. Frank Sinatra didn't just sing the American songbook. He knew how to play the political tune, too, changing the melody just enough to keep the spotlight on himself, while everyone else danced to his rhythm. Marcia Hunt's silent resistance. She never headlined a blockbuster. She wasn't a scandal magnet, but Marcia Hunt quietly became one of the bravest women in Hollywood's blacklist era. A rising star in the 1940s, Hunt had dozens of credits to her name and a wholesome image the studios loved. But underneath that polished smile was a woman who refused to look the other way. In 1947, she joined the Committee for the First Amendment, a coalition of actors, directors, and writers who openly opposed HUAC's campaign against suspected communists. They took out full-page ads, spoke at rallies, and flew to Washington to observe the hearings. Hunt didn't testify, but just standing in the courtroom put a target on her back. Studios quietly labeled her uncooperative. Roles dried up. Her agent stopped calling. Friends vanished overnight. She never joined the Communist Party. She never called herself radical, but she didn't need to. Just opposing the blacklist was enough to blacklist her. Instead of retreating, Hunt turned to humanitarian work. She supported UN efforts, advocated for world hunger initiatives, and kept speaking out for those silenced by fear. Years later, when asked why she risked her career, she simply said, "I thought freedom mattered more than work." Hunt lived to 104, long enough to see her legacy restored. She may never have gotten a comeback movie, but she didn't need one. Her story is a reminder that not all resistance is loud. Sometimes it's quiet, principled, and it lasts far longer than fame. Claudette Colbert's secret French support. She played elegant women on screen, high society types, worldly yet warm. But behind Hollywood glamour, Claudette Colbert lived a double life that few Americans ever knew. Born in France and raised in the US, she quietly remained devoted to her homeland, even as World War II tore Europe apart. While the Nazis occupied France, Colbert funneled money, supplies, and morale to the Free French Resistance, all while keeping her efforts out of the headlines. Why the secrecy? In the early 1940s, before the US officially entered the war, public support for foreign intervention was divided. Hollywood was under intense scrutiny, and Colbert, a top box office draw, was told to stay neutral. But neutrality wasn't in her blood. Working through intermediaries, she donated proceeds from her films to aid French refugees, funded underground newspapers, and hosted clandestine fundraisers in Beverly Hills. She never spoke about it publicly. Even studio bosses didn't know the full extent of her involvement. When France was liberated, Charles de Gaulle's provisional government sent a quiet message of thanks, but Colbert never cashed in on the gesture. No press tours, no interviews, no medals, just relief. Decades later, biographers unearthed her letters and correspondence, revealing the extent of her contributions. They showed a woman who understood the politics of silence, who used her fame not to broadcast, but to protect. In a town addicted to self-promotion, Colbert's resistance was an act of subtle, dignified patriotism. Not the American kind, but the kind that risked everything for the country she never stopped loving. Orson Welles and the suppressed power of Citizen Kane. When Orson Welles released Citizen Kane in 1941, he knew he was poking a bear. What he didn't know was that the bear had claws in Washington. The character of Charles Foster Kane, a ruthless media tycoon, was a barely veiled portrait of William Randolph Hearst, the real-life newspaper baron with a direct line to politicians, businessmen, and federal enforcers. The moment Hearst saw the film, the war began. Hearst banned mention of Kane in all his newspapers. He threatened theater owners with blackouts. He pressured studio heads to bury the film entirely. And he wasn't bluffing. He had dirt on half of Hollywood. The FBI, already wary of Welles for his outspoken liberalism and ties to anti-fascist causes, began watching him more closely. Hoover added Welles to his potential subversive list. and quietly opened a surveillance file. Wells, only 26 at the time, found himself locked out of the very system he helped elevate. His follow-up projects were delayed, re-edited, or quietly canceled. Even as Citizen Kane was hailed by critics, its creator was becoming unemployed. The political pressure wasn't overt, it was ambient. A phone that stopped ringing, a script stuck in limbo, a budget that vanished. Wells would spend decades bouncing from Europe to Hollywood, always working, always hustling, but never with the same power. Kane made him immortal, but it also made him dangerous. In the end, Hearst didn't have to sue. He didn't need to silence Wells in a courtroom. He used something more effective, influence. And in Hollywood, influence is the sharpest weapon of all. In the shadows of the spotlight, Hollywood wasn't just making movies, it was moving pieces on a political chessboard. For every red carpet rolled out, a blacklist was quietly drawn. Stars who played lovers on screen played spies, shields, or sacrificial pawns off it. And when the cameras stopped, the real drama began. Covert deals, silent resistance, and careers erased in the name of ideology. So, next time you watch a Golden Age classic, remember, some of the biggest performances happened when no one was watching.